Welcome to this episode of the WhatsOnStage Podcast with me, Alex Wood.
And me, Sarah Crompton.
This is a slightly unorthodox recording that we've managed to pull off here because it's actually recorded in two parts, and we are recording this part, the first part, after the second part. So we're almost prologuing ourselves. And we challenge you, dear listeners, to try and work out where the cut eventually comes. But Sarah, do you want to explain why we've had to do this very unorthodox and slightly unconventional approach to recording this episode?
Yes, and which we're hoping will work. And I think it will. So it's Alex's, because we're trendsetters, because we're so absolutely on the money that we recorded a podcast about our thoughts about touring and the problems being faced by regional theatres, which for different reasons we had both started to think about. And then, unbeknownst to us, the Society of London Theatre had commissioned a report on on similar themes. I mean, certainly touching touring and about the problems faced by regional theatres and the financial strain that is now on them, which is threatening insolvency. That report, which Alex is going to outline to you in full, came out the day after we'd done our initial recording. So this is our top-up thought on the report, which is quite a worrying piece of research that has just emerged.
It landed in my inbox under embargo, I think probably about an hour after we finished recording, and I just thought, darn it, so many talking points we could have embellished. But yes, to your point, it is called The State of British Theatre in 2025, Growth, Risk and the Urgent Need for Public Investment. 44 pages long. It is probably one of the most comprehensive appraisals of the current state of British theatre. So not only does it run through hot topics like ticket prices, it also talks about some testimonials and case studies from big shows that have succeeded to say, look, this is what can happen when British theatre receives the care and attention it deserves. It can reap huge rewards, not just in the theatre industry, but well beyond that in terms of what we're exporting on the global market or regenerating our high streets. And all of that does tie into what we're going to be talking about touring in the second half of this episode. But in a way, it shows such a mixed picture of the current state of UK theatre. And it's really quite scary, some of the stats, and they jump out at you very unexpectedly because you're reading some quite positive things about, well, look, we've managed to boost our audiences by 2 or 4%, or we've managed to keep ticket prices in line with inflation, and then it's like, wham, a third of venues think they're going to close in the next sort of few years unless they have some form of capital investment. Obviously, what the timing for this report is very important because the Society of London Theatre and UK Theatre are putting it out just before the major spending review that takes place in June. So this is essentially a way of appealing to the government and saying, look, the arts are such a valuable commodity and they provide so much, not only economically, but also for every community, that it would be wrong to sort of ignore them during your annual spending review. So that's essentially, this is a manifesto for the arts in many ways, provided by SALT and UK Theatre to say, look, this is what we need in order to continue growing and thriving. But without this, without investment or without care and attention, actually the arts are going to fall by the wayside and we're going to lose a huge number of venues. Was there any of the stats there, Sarah, that really stood out to you in terms of what struck you reading it?
A few of them do. I mean, the main one is since 2010, funding from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has fallen by 32% per person in real terms, which is a lot. And local authority support, which particularly affects the regional theatres, have declined by as much as 48%. And the report very much sets those falls against rising costs, which are the rising costs that we are all experiencing as citizens, but which affect heat, light, costs of keeping a building going, rising staffing costs. So you've got this incredible squeeze going on to the theatrical sector, even though, in fact, the numbers of people going to the theatre and enjoying what they're seeing has gone back up since the pandemic. So that bounce of audiences coming back is there. The one piece of good news in this report, I think, apart from the fact that people are still going to the theatre, is that the ticket prices are not as high as everybody says. And I think that's just worth saying before we go on to discuss all the bleak stuff, that in fact, West End ticket prices have fallen by 5.3% in real terms. And the most tickets are sold at £56 or less, and fewer than 4% exceeding £150. £50. And I think that's important in context because there is an awful lot of stuff about theatre not being good value for money. And in fact, it remains exceptional value for money. So I think that's the sort of good thing. And the fact that, 37 million people have been to the theatre. That's a lot of theatre. So that's on top of this incredible bleakness about costs and the dangers of insolvency. And that is particularly affecting the regions where at the end of 2024, 61% of the leaders surveyed by SALT and UK Theatre reported a surplus, while 27% were in deficit. And the report forecast that number operating at a loss will rise to 32% next year. The truth is that those theatres that are running at a loss are at threat of insolvency. They're at threat of closing altogether, and their venues across country. So that's very, very worrying.
I'd want to just circle back quickly to the point on ticket prices because it is really fascinating. What they mention in the survey of 20,000 West End theatregoers is that 62% believe that prices have risen faster than other goods, with 26.2 thinking that they'd increased exponentially. And then they lay out all this data, as you mentioned very comprehensively, that actually, in real terms, ticket prices have not gone up since 2019. They're actually 5% lower for the West End and 9.8% lower for regional theatres. So why have people got this perception that West End theatre tickets have gone up so much? And one theory I had at 1 a.m. last night, I woke up in a flurry of revelation, is that people had 2 years where they didn't go to the theatre. So between 2020 and possibly early 2022, there were people that wouldn't go to the theatre at all. And over that time, with inflation, ticket prices will invariably have gone up. So you return to ticket prices and you're like, oh gosh, wow, these have gone up so much. When actually, in line with everything else that you don't notice, they haven't actually gone up very much in comparison to other goods and services. So that's why I think people pay more attention to theatre tickets going up in price, because of that sort of, you only dip into the theatre world occasionally, maybe once or twice a year if you're the average theatre goer or the average Joe Bloggs on the street that wants to see a jukebox musical at their local venue every 6 months. Whereas, if you're going to the supermarket every week, you probably don't notice a 2 to 3 pence increase on some of your local amenities or food and drink. So in a way, West End tickets become a lightning rod for this inflation that's going on. Then, of course, you hit 2023 and it gets even more extreme with things like the cost of living surges and everything else and the hyperinflation that took place. Again, obviously, it's going to lead to higher ticket prices. One thing that the report really states is that actually theatres have been the one that have absorbed so much of these cost pressures. So they've noted that energy bills have gone up by 120% since 2019, which is astronomical for these huge, often quite old and sometimes very energy inefficient venues. And like you say, public subsidies are down by 48%. And as we actually mentioned later on in this episode of the podcast, there's also increased capital maintenance and staffing costs that mean that, it's almost incredible the work that is done to keep ticket prices where they are, because we could easily end up in a situation like Broadway. I'd also encourage anyone to look through the report, and there's actually a really fantastic breakdown of the costs required to bring a show to the West End in terms of weekly running fees.
Yes, that's amazing that those figures about the weekly running fees, because that's like something like £600,000 a week or something, isn't it?
Yeah, for a big West End musical with, hundreds of often 150 to 200 staff coming in and out of the building every week, it is upwards of 400, 500, 600,000, which basically means that the shows need to make that much money in purely to break even.
Yeah,
and that's in the West End, which is meant to be in rude health and that, compared to the regional venue.
Yeah, and the other point that it makes is that the shows that we view as successes only start to turn a profit towards the end of their run because of that. So that's another bit of the theatrical economy that is out of sync. West End producers have always allowed for a period where they would effectively be making back what they'd spent. But then, there was the jam, whereas the jam is getting very, very close to closure. So even a show that you say, and I know this from talking to a couple of producers, even the things that they're thinking are hits and that they know are doing well will make their money start to make a profit very late in the run. And so most shows are doing and making that successful shows is making their money back. And there are other factors, as I understand it, that stop you sort of building on the profit, that you quite often can't stay in the theatre. Quite often the shows that are hits are on limited runs. So you haven't got that much time to make your money. I mean, I must say that the whole effect of the report is to make you sense the pressures on theatres that they have actually valiantly withstood for a very long period of time. And as you say, can't go on. That's the plea. That's saying we just assume this will be all right, but actually now we're at the point where it won't be all right anymore. And I think the other thing I'd say about the ticket price thing is it's an agenda led by news editors above all. You know, news editors, I've worked for, most of my career until the last 10 years, I worked in newspapers. I always have understood news. And what you want is a new line, an exciting line, a headline. And the headline will always be the ticket that's sold for 300 quid for a great show. It won't be the 40,000 tickets that have sold for 10 quid or whatever. So that's the constant reporting of theatre as an expensive activity is disguising this sense underneath it that actually it's not an expensive activity. And as you say, a lot of the price rises have been absorbed by producers and by venues, and they are continuing to offer extreme value for money at some cost to themselves.
I guess it's also in this cost of living crisis, people have less disposable income. So going to the theatre fundamentally takes up more of the disposable income that you do have. So therefore it does feel more expensive, even if it actually, in real terms, adjusted for inflation, isn't. So I guess that's also part of the picture that has to be acknowledged when people do. And like you say, those headline-grabbing moments don't go into that much nuance. They just say, look, all these money-grabbing theatre producers want to take your dosh and then put on a mid-scale, mid-level production for you. And because they've cast someone from a big soap, they think they can get away with it, which is... people don't go into the theatre industry to make money. They go into it because they love live entertainment. Otherwise, they just go into investment banking and make 10 times more with 1,000 times less effort. I do think that there's something that needs to be written in a lot of detail. But like you say, maybe the horse has left the stable, really. You can't really solve that problem anymore if the perception's already there. Or it will take a long time for it to be adjusted anyway.
I think it'll take a long time, but I think it is possible. I mean, I think this report has fulfilled a valuable function in calling attention to it and calling attention to it now. And before we go on to touring, the other problem that theatres are facing is capital investment. So one of the problems is that so much money is absorbing the rising running costs, but substantial capital investment is needed in the infrastructure. And that warning is even more stark, that they are saying that nearly 40% of venues could be forced to close, and nearly another 40% may become too unsafe to use. And that's scary. I mean, actually, I have to say, I was at the theatre not long ago and I thought, good grief, I'm not sure about the fire exits from this theatre. And I know they meet standards, but you know that quite often you're sitting in structures that are just safe. And if the infrastructure deteriorates, they will become unsafe. And that's, grim warning for the future.
Well, I feel as though that is probably a point to ask you, Sarah, where would you like to begin with talking about the touring sector?
I'm clearing the loft at the moment, and that's involving throwing out huge amounts of old newspaper cuttings, which is alarming in quite a lot of ways. It's amazing what newspapers used to be like and how big they were and how long the articles in them were, and how long the reviews. Oh my goodness, thousands and thousands of words on Sondheim or Brecht or any, really detailed reviews which you learn from. And what has struck me is, like you, I've spent a lot of my life living outside London, and I realised that I saw so much that was on tour. I mean, I saw Margot Fonteyn, I always say this, at the Manchester Opera House, when the Royal Ballet used to tour, which, marks me out as a dinosaur because it's so long since the Royal Ballet managed to leave its London base. But also just shows that I was picking up all the time in different places that were coming to the Oxford Playhouse, that were coming to Coventry, Warwick. There was a really rich touring circuit, both for dance and for theatre. So I think that's where I started thinking of the Bloody Poetry, for example, an almost forgotten play that was shared experience and toured the regions, and I saw it in Leicester. And it's one of the plays that I really remember having an incredible impact on me, because it was a different kind of acting, it was a different way of looking at literature and the world. And yeah, that's what triggered me. What triggered you in terms of thinking about this?
So I remember back at the National Theatre's season launch, and I know we've covered that in quite extensive detail, Kate Vara saying how next to impossible it is to tour to theatres these days without state support of some kind. And we'll come on to that and what the state has been doing, because it hasn't been as inert as thankfully it could have been. And also the cancellation of shows like Let the Right One In, when that full tour was just completely pulled without any notice, to big productions that have disappeared that, probably pre-pandemic might have been able to go ahead. The cost wouldn't have been severe. But time and again, you're hearing about how there's extraordinary costs associated with touring that now make it just completely unviable. And the business model always relies on, say, 1 or 2 percentage points. That means the difference between a profitable show, or at least a break-even show, and a financial dud. So at that point, you just don't take the risk when the odds are stacked against you. What we've noticed, I think, and you and I have both been researching this over the last few days, is it's the larger venues like the big ATG, Bristol Hippodromes, Edinburgh Playhouses that can get those blockbuster productions in that sell out every seat are probably doing slightly better than the mid-scale regional houses that can't get those big blockbuster shows but rely on a steady stream of productions in order to stay afloat. So I think that's probably the interesting point to start with, is talking about what's going on with those mid-scale venues, and is there a positive future for them in any way?
Yeah, so I think it is interesting, because that was the other starting point, wasn't it? Because James Graham's Dear England is touring extensively to a number of large and mid-scale venues, and the National has taken the hit on that. I mean, that was what Kate Barra was talking about. So she said, they have decided to put it out and let as many people as possible see it, which is brilliant, but it is also a surefire hit. It's a play like Warhorse, which the National tours fairly regularly, that is going to be guaranteed to get 90% audiences and can just about make the margins work. The people I've been talking to are touring mid-scale and smaller shows, and they're touring shows that are guaranteed to be popular, but might not be 90% popular. So 90% capacity. And what they are saying to me, and which I think possibly affected the Right One In tour, is that the margins are too small. So if you're a subsidised theatre, then in the past, a subsidised company, in the past, part of that subsidy might have enabled you to tour. So you're a small scale company of 12 people. You say to a theatre, I've got this rather good product, I'm coming in do you want to have a look at it? And pre-pandemic, you might have been offered a fee by that theatre, say of £5,000. And you would know that your tour was going to cost you £8,000 a venue, but you would essentially say, well, that's what the subsidy's for. So we'll take a gamble, we'll come in and we'll run at a loss, but we'll run at a loss that is acceptable. What I'm hearing is that post-pandemic, two things have happened. One is that the fees that theatres are offering have been cut still further. And obviously the subsidy has stayed the same for about 20 years. Subsidised companies are not getting more money. By and large, they're working in the same budgets. So they say the theatres are offering you a lower fee. So before they might have offered you 5,000, now they're offering you 2,000, say, but your costs will have risen to 10,000. And on top of that, there's a thing called the contra charges, which theatres charge to the travelling companies. Pre-pandemic, if you were powerful and you were popular, you could say, I'm not going to take on the contra charges. Post-pandemic, the costs are rising, not only your costs of the hotels and getting the train fares and all the rest of it, but also you're being asked by the theatres to bear the cost of the get in and the get out, technical costs if they need to employ more technicians. And you're paying for the contras as a touring company. And that just wipes out any possibility at all, as I understand it, of touring to smaller venues. Bigger towns, it's still okay because they've got staff. So those costs are not so high. But if you're using freelance technicians, freelance roadies and so on, then those costs are going up and up. So that's what I'm hearing, and is really, really causing problems.
Important to note that the pressure sits at both ends of the chain, so to speak, and the local theatre touring alliance was set up last month, really, which is a grand union of smaller scale regional venues coming together to sort of sound this alarm. And they're saying even the venues are feeling incredible amounts of pressure because of operational costs. You know, if you think about the rise in energy prices, for example, but also now there's such difficulty finding skilled staff that are willing to work backstage for relatively low salaries when they might find something more lucrative in other sectors. And, you know, really importantly, these buildings aren't getting younger. And if there isn't the investment in the infrastructure of these buildings, they will fall apart, and that will cause increased burdens on the venues themselves. So they have sort of said, look, simultaneously, our costs are going up, but we're also not getting these high quality productions coming to us. So that's meaning that we're not being able to entice new audiences in. So it's quite scary for those smaller venues. I think Katie Town, who is the exec director of Theatre Royal Wakefield, said that mid-scale venues are facing unprecedented challenges. But, you know, she was optimistic in saying that, you know, if we work collaboratively, there is huge potential there. And I think that's an important note to strike, to sort of add a positive spin for a few moments, to say what we have noticed, especially in recent years, is the number of co-productions has increased massively, really since the pandemic. You've seen so many shows that will start at, say, one local venue and then they'll hop to another one. I think, for example, we announced yesterday that the last 5 years is opening at the Reading Rep, which is a very lovely, intimate theatre in Reading. Then it's moving to the Barn Theatre in Cirencester. Then it's going to the Ustinov Studio in Bath. So those three venues working in tandem can allow a show to have a 3-month lifespan that then will allow it to gain some momentum and have some audiences and have more press engagement, etc. So the degree of pragmatism that is being shown by these venues cannot be overstated. But at the same time, there will be a limit at some point. There will come a breaking point. The other thing that has become quite apparent since COVID in particular is the complete demise of local council funding. 2018 and 2019, the local council funding for the arts in the UK amounted to around £1.3 billion, which coincidentally is the exact same amount that was given as part of the COVID recovery fund in 2020 and 2021. And that number has just been falling and falling annually ever since. And as local councils are facing huge budgetary pressures across all different sectors, the arts is always one that takes the hit first. So it's almost like we're slowly losing a COVID recovery fund's worth of funding every year that used to be able to support these capital regeneration projects or to support local outreach, etc. That's just not happening. I think the Birmingham Rep, for example, has lost the equivalent of about £1 million worth of local funding. And, you know, if someone turns around in a local council meeting and says, we can choose between funding nurses or social care, or we can choose between funding our local theatre, there's no conversation that can be had there, which is awful in many ways, but that's just the reality that local councils are facing. So that again is extra pressure on these mid-scale local venues.
Yeah, that I mean, and Birmingham counts as a big city, and that's really interesting because I was in Birmingham recently and was talking with people who I'd known in my time there, and we were discussing the fact that, you know, when a lot of us started off going to Birmingham to see things, it was the point where Simon Rattle was at Symphony Hall. There was the whole idea of creating a cultural quarter which would help with the regeneration of Birmingham. And it worked. I mean, that though, you know, the vibrancy of the music, the dance, Birmingham Royal Ballet going there, of the theatres, of which Birmingham has a lot, really did help with the regeneration of Birmingham. But now it's tipping back and everybody's struggling because the council's bankrupt, because it can barely afford to clean the rubbish off its streets, famously at the moment. And I think it is a really interesting point that we've reached. And the other factor that you and I were talking about is Nicholas Sirota, chair of the Arts Council, has made an intervention in the past couple of weeks and has given an interview in which he says we are at a tipping point, that for 25 years, arts funding has not risen in this country. In the city of Berlin, there was an outcry recently because there was a threat to reduce the city's arts funding to about 800 million. The funding for the whole of the arts in the United Kingdom from the Arts Council is 450 million. And the point he made was that it's a tipping point. For years and years, everybody's been inventive, everybody's cut their coats, everybody's found ways of keeping the arts going. But you are at a point now where everybody is struggling. And part of what happens is if you take the public money out of the arts or don't increase it, it's harder to increase philanthropic support of the arts, because the idea that you're using public money to support the arts attracts philanthropy. And that's how the sort of mixed economy of the arts in Britain has always worked. And that, again, has enabled companies to be bold, to go on tour and all the rest of it. The problem is that this is all happening when the NHS needs money, when the roads need money, where you need money to support the infrastructure of the country. Arts seems unimportant. And yet the arts are vital to the social cohesion and well-being of the country, which is sort of what I was thinking about when I was looking through my old press cuttings, because I am this person sitting in a regional city with an interest that was nurtured by people coming to bring arts to me. I didn't go anywhere to find the arts. They arrived on my doorstep. And I think that's the great danger, that you're impoverishing everybody, really, by not enabling touring and so on. And the Arts Council does its best. This isn't a knock of the Arts Council at all, but it is just a fact that everything's getting horribly squeezed at the same moment.
The Arts Council was, whereas I was going to turn next, in terms of they have recognised that important collaboration between the commercial and the subsidised sector. So they have announced in the last couple of months the incentivising touring scheme, where they're working with a series of commercial and subsidised producers to provide £2 million of repayable grants to help producers bring large-scale theatre and dance to audiences in all 9 English regions. And they said that they're going to hit around 90% of the English population living within an hour's drive of at least one location on the various tours. I mean, the words repayable grant sounds as though, for me, that's just an interest-free loan, which, still means it has to be paid back, I'm guessing, unless it's just badly worded on the Arts Council front and it is actually a grant. But if it's repayable, I don't think then you're not just going to get that money without having to reciprocate in some way. But some of the shows that are touring there, you've got Dear England as part of that scheme. And that's also something that Kate Vara was talking about how they're receiving assistance in order to make this tour work. One of the other tours is Fiddler on the Roof, the Olivier Award-winning production that started in London and is now visiting all across the UK. But there's also the Chichester Festival theatre production of Top Hat, which is being co-produced by Kenny Wax, who obviously was instrumental in Six the Musical, and that continues to tour and fill out houses across the UK. Luckily, is quite a small show, so Six, for example, is very cheap. Top Hat is massive by comparison. And Kenny Wax actually said something very interesting when they announced this Arts Council incentivising touring scheme. He said, "The West End is enjoying a halcyon period, but the regional touring market hasn't quite yet fully recovered from COVID. Touring a production with a cast of 26 and an orchestra of 11 is ambitious at any time, but this feel-good spectacular is just the sort of show to encourage audiences back into town centres, which should be at the heart of a city regenerating soft power with restaurants, bars and transport systems all benefiting from packed theatres." So that, in a perfect nutshell, sums up everything that we're talking about how if you provide that little bit of security to these commercial producers or whoever, that they can take these interesting and ambitious shows, it's not just the theatres that benefit, it's the entire hospitality sector around the venue. transport infrastructure, everyone's winning. You're regenerating your local high street if you're supporting the theatre. But for me, that's a very small select group of producers that are benefiting from this. And they say it's only a pilot scheme at the moment, but are we going to have to be in a situation where the Arts Council is having to convince commercial producers to even look beyond the West End? Because the West End, as Kenny Wax says, is where the big money can be made with a big hit. Whereas touring, it's a slow burn and it's a long process, especially if you're going for those mid-level shows. So that for me added an extra layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant what he says as well, because he's absolutely right. You know, I've been in Norwich quite a lot recently, and one of the things I like about being in Norwich is that if there's a show on at the theatre that's popular, you do get that buzz around the theatre and all the restaurants and bars are full. You know, Norwich has brilliant independent food venues and they do benefit. You can see that happening of everybody coming in for the show and then going out to eat or drink. And without the show, it doesn't happen. I mean, why, you know, you might come in for a meal, but there's something nice about that whole ecology around that. And also, I do think Wax is right that the sheer logistics, even without the contras, of touring a show that's got a cast of 26. I mean, that's all the hotel rooms, all the train fares. If you're trying to be green, it's about electric vehicles moving people around, so you can't just get any old cheap coach. The orchestra, everybody has to be fed, everybody has to be cared for. It's a massive, massive undertaking, but it is worth it in terms of how of the spillover into town centres. And because the danger is, if you read somebody like David Hare when he writes about touring, how touring worked in the 1960s, was you had the big spectaculars and they were filling the palace theatres and the opera houses and the hippodromes. And because they were commercially reliable, that they could, you know, you could make your money back. You could fill the house for however long. But the smaller shows, the new plays and so on, they were literally touring in the back of vans. And people may say that that's where we all have to go back to. And that's what, you know, if people want tours, then you playwright packs up the cast and drives up motorway. But there is a level of work that stops. And that's the worry. And I do think that the ability to take a gamble, looking again at the dance world, you know, you can see Swan Lake, you can see the Nutcracker. It's really hard to see new work in the regions now. People are doing. Norwich is one of the cities that's doing it and is encouraging it. Brighton's another. But it's tragic that you don't get that richness of companies moving around and showing new work that you can take a gamble on as an audience. And I think it eats into the idea of what theatre going, what dance going is. If you always think you've got to go to the hit, then it changes the nature of what producers and directors and writers are writing. And that's the other side of it. So it just diminishes choice, I think.
When there was the responses to the article last month or the month before about this regional crisis, one of the factors was also that event theatre is so much more important now, and people aren't willing to go and see anything. They want to go and see something special. And that does affect how venues are looking to programme. They're looking for those exciting shows that come with a bit of clout. People aren't going to go and see, say, straight down the middle Alan Ayckbourn revival if they might have done, say, 20 years ago, which is sad because it means that there's a lot of plays that go underappreciated. It's funny how if you look at what succeeds now on the regional touring space, it's always the big names. And thank God that those big names are willing to go touring, because without them, so, you know, you look at something like Inside Number 9 with Rhys Shearsmith and Steve Pemberton doing a big tour that's now almost selling out. They've added more performances this week, in fact, for a tour, which is almost unheard of. You've then got Jodie Comer going out on a massive tour in 2026. Again, fantastic that she's willing to do that. And even shows like Operation Mincemeat, we were talking about 6 being small. Operation Mincemeat with a cast of 5 is also incredibly small. And that is touring to, as I mentioned on last week's episode, over 30 different venues across 2026, which any venue would jump at the opportunity to take a crowd-pleasing, multi-award-winning musical that's been successful on Broadway. And it's fantastic that those producers are willing to give those shows a shot, because they know that cultivating a regional audience is so important for the future of the art form, really. The one final sort of warning sign that I've had is also there's all the rumblings now about DCMS. And as much as we can praise those initiatives that the Arts Council have put together, if DCMS doesn't survive the next year or two, there's this huge horizon of uncertainty around what the state of public funding for the arts will look like. And anyone reading those headlines in the Sunday Times saying that DCMS is going to be split up and arranged in lots of different parts surely isn't going to be wanting to hedge any bets on where they're going to be touring in 2027 or 2028, because they don't know what the financial situation is going to be like. That for me is quite concerning, that those reports are dripping out, and those do affect the sense of comfort and well-being that exist in the theatre ecosystem. Yeah,
and I do think that, again, I always feel as if I'm just always looking at the past. And I don't mean to, because in many ways I feel that the present is really vibrant and exciting and, developing in all kinds of unexpected ways. I'm not a great nostalgist, if that's the word, or one for nostalgia. But the truth is that when the Labour government, the post-1945 Labour government came into being, it appointed Jenny Lee as a Minister of Culture. And the economy shattered. The NHS had yet to be born. There was no care for anybody. And so in the course of rebuilding the state, the Labour Party at that period thought it was worth rebuilding culture as well. And all the commercial benefits that have accrued to this country from the absolute boom in the culture industry since the war came from that commitment by Labour. And there's no doubt that the creative sector is this huge boon to the economy and to people's lives. So I do think there is a great danger, warnings from the past. There's a great danger in saying the arts will look after themselves. They'll always be all right because they're full of people who are creative and care about them. Lots of those little structures that have been in existence since that period are beginning to decline and be eaten away. And the danger is that something you think will be there forever and that is a boon in so many ways is really under threat. And, as people who grew up loving theatre and who have now made their contribution to the world, to the economy through our working lives, through theatre in different ways, then it is a worry. It's really frightening. And, it feels very threadbare. It's like a carpet that's just about to go through. And you're right, if the Department of Culture, Media and Sport vanishes and that voice in government vanishes, that feels like a very bleak day.
My levels of pessimism, forward-looking pessimism, was sort of exacerbated slightly by this new deal that came out over the weekend or over the last few days between the UK and the EU. And there's a lot made about the fishing industries, etc., and agriculture, which obviously are huge, important things to be worrying about. Well, maybe not in the course of fishing. I hear the fishing industry isn't exactly the biggest in the world when compared to culture, but there was barely any mention of cultural exchange. There was no subsidy or arrangement in place to assist with new systems to help musicians travel between EU countries, and no sort of visa provisions, etc. And that for me felt like a big glaring omission, or highlighted in a way that the UK government clearly doesn't see culture as a priority. And I was just looking for something saying, oh yes, we're going to implement a new scheme to allow border-free touring for UK artists to reflect the incredible soft power of the UK creative industries. Bish bash bosh, no one would have minded. I don't think it would have generated any headlines. But just to be able to say, look, now a musician can tour between Slovenia, Italy, Albania, and not have to face charges as it hit different borders. And I know that there are specific visa systems in place that can facilitate that. But having some sort of UK-EU deal to allow artistic exchange to be a straightforward process would have been so easy to implement. And it would not have been a hard thing. And it would have been a slam dunk for our industry to know that that is back on the table, because European touring has taken such a hit since Brexit. And nothing has really been done to solve this. And it could have been solved overnight. And it wasn't, because it wasn't a priority for the UK government. And again, I think that just boils all the way back to why our mid-scale venues are feeling neglected, and the points that they continue to try and make just go completely unheard by the decision makers at the top. Because funding the arts and culture is seen as a woke snowflake thing to do in this day and age, if I'm deploying that sort of annoying language. If you look in the Reform Manifesto, as I had the ill fortune of having to do, culture is not mentioned once in the entire thing. So there's all these councils now that have got reform majorities, and there is no policy decision making on culture whatsoever. So, what is the future of those councils going to be? We just don't know. And we don't know, like, Nigel Farage might go to Panto every year and love it and decide that he's going to keep going or keep pushing that in local context. But there's just no evidence that that's the case. I feel as though there just needs to be someone in government that stands up and says, this is what culture is worth. This is why we need to put this money into it. And this is what it's going to do for local regenerations. And there's so many people in our sector willing to make that case, but so little in terms of reciprocal conversation being done. And Lisa Nandy appears from time to time, and she makes very strong points, and she fights the fight, but we just don't see the tangible results then coming from it, as we've seen with this EU deal, where there is no mention of culture beyond a passing reference to a continued effort to support where possible, which isn't exactly a commitment or a policy.
Well, that's a powerful rallying cry with which I can only agree. I mean, I feel it has been a slightly depressing episode, but it is trying to draw attention to some of the things that are going on behind the curtain in the arts at the moment, which is easy to forget about when on the face of it, everything is so shiny, shiny and new and wonderful. So I think it's worth just occasionally saying, hang on a minute, this is all happening. And it's quite difficult.
Yeah, it's like Kenny Wax says, it's the halcyon period for the West End. It's incredible the numbers that West End shows are doing, and the disparity is only getting wider between regional venues and the West End. But those two ecosystems are so symbiotically linked. Like, the West End can only thrive if there's a strong regional presence, as we've spoken about many times over on the podcast.
Endlessly.
Yes.
It's our theme. Coming back next week with very cheering news about something. But in the meantime, leaving you with those slightly frustrated thoughts, I think. So it's goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. Thank you for listening to this episode of the What's on Stage podcast. Make sure you like, follow, leave a comment, subscribe, or rate the episode wherever you can. We'll be back with regular episodes every Friday, alongside a smattering of bonus episodes in between.